What is producing? What is mixing? What is mastering? Groups, buses, auxes, sends, return, tonal balance, peak, LUFS, reference tracks. In this video, I'm going to try to make sense of all these terms in an easy and comprehensible way. So this video is for you who is a beginner when it comes to mixing, but maybe you're more seasoned when it comes to making music. Let's go. This is the first video in an 8-part series that I call Mixing for Beginners, and here I'll cover the most important terms that is needed to explain the mixing process. So first off, producing. The word has a lot of different associations. When it comes to the hip-hop culture, producers are typically the ones making the beats, whilst there still needs to be a producer who produces the rap verses, the hook, and the beats, and arrange it all and make it into a complete whole. The producer is the one who ties all the knots together and always looks at the bigger picture, what will serve the song best. That's the producer's role. And then comes the mix engineer. Mixing is to get the most out of each individual track in the mix, and that can be everything from a couple of tracks to 60, 70, 80 tracks, and make all those tracks blend well, find pockets of space for each and every track, have them in the back of the mix, in the front, and make some priorities as to which tracks are most important in the mix and which are less important. So a mixer or a mix engineer is the one who makes the song come to life as much as it can. And then comes the last process, the final process is mastering, and that's when you take the finished product that the mix engineer did, because he did his best in making it sound as good as possible. Then you send it to another guy who will take that stereo file and make it maybe even a bit better. Or not, depending on what the material is. Many times a mastering engineer only needs to put on the final limiter and call it a day. The mastering engineer makes sure that everything is okay with the song before it can be released. So to summarize, the main difference between a producer and a mix engineer is that the producer is tying everything together, whilst the mixer is finalizing the product, making sure everything sounds as good as possible, and the mastering engineer is like a double checker to make sure that everything sounds great. And the mastering engineer typically has a room that is really well treated for critical listening and has maybe the best possible equipment to really hear all the details that's going on, so you have a guarantee that nothing is wrong with the audio track. Okay, so that's producing, mixing, and mastering. Now comes all those silly terms. DAW stands for Digital Audio Workstation, and that's, for example, Pro Tools, Cubase, Ableton Live, Reason Studios, Logic Pro, Studio One, Bitwig, Reaper, FL Studio, and so on. The DAW is kind of like the brain of all music production, where you put in all your tracks and you treat them the way you want, you manipulate them. That's when you're mixing. But when you can also produce in a DAW, so you can make songs from scratch using samples or recording instruments and vocals and so on. And let me know down there which is your favorite DAW. Mine is Logic Pro. Now comes tracks. What are tracks? So tracks are actually two things when we're talking about mixing and mastering. The first thing that comes to mind is a track is like a song. So that's one stereo file with the song in it. And you go to Spotify, you listen to a track there, and then you switch song, you just listen to another track. Another way of looking at tracks is the individual elements of a mix. You put in a kick, snare, hi-hat. Those are 3 different tracks many times. Sometimes you have a drum loop and you have only one stereo file of the drum loop. Then the drum loop is one track. Piano, saxophone, lead vocal, and so on. Those are individual tracks in a mix. And if you like this video so far, hit the like button, consider subscribing if you want more videos like these. And then come regions, and those are all those colored boxes that live inside the DAW session view, like this and this and this. And these are containers of audio or MIDI information. And oftentimes when we are mixing, we only operate with audio regions, but when we are producing and making and creating music, you might have a lot of MIDI regions as well. So these are the regions. And then you have stems, and you have probably heard, can you please send me the stems so I can mix them? Or when you buy that beat, does it come with stems as well? Stems are the different categories or groups of sounds that make up a whole composition. So the drums is a stem, the bass is a stem, the instrument section is a stem, and it can be also divided into, for example, synths and special effects and guitars and what have you, but it depends on how broad scope you have on the stems. Usually when I operate with stems, I have drums, bass, instruments, vocals, sometimes backing vocals and lead vocals as separate stems, but basically that stems are broader categories. They are not the track outs. A track out would be all the individual tracks, kick, snare, bass, hi-hats, cymbals, and so on and so forth. Stems are more grouped together. So that's the difference between tracks and stems. Next up, the mixer. So here's the mixer view. Of course, you've seen the audio engineer on concerts. They always have a mixer, a physical mixer. And in studios, back in the days especially, they had physical faders in their studio with analog channels and such. Nowadays, many people work with DAWs also professionally in studios. But as you can see here, here's a digital representation of the classic console mixer. In a mixer, in a DAW, you typically have audio tracks, you have MIDI tracks, and you have auxes, and you have VCAs. I won't come into that just now because it's not relevant. You would have buses, and you would have stereo output or a master. So that's typically the mixer. And a channel strip like this consists of the channel fader, which is the final output volume for that specific channel strip. So this is a channel strip. It has inserts for insert effects, and that's plugins or processors that you would put in on the specific channel, for example, EQs and compressors and so on. And you would have also the panning button, which I will come back to, and you would have options for where to route that channel strip and where to send that channel strip, and I will come back to that also later. So mixer is where all the mixing is actually happening, where you blend sounds together using faders and pan knobs and what have you. Which brings us to the paneration knob, or the pan knob. You can select where in the stereo spectrum you want that track to live. So you can pan it all the way to the left. You will only hear that track on your left ear, especially if you use headphones. You will hear that very specifically, that you only have sound in one ear. But if you hear with monitors, you will have this I don't know what's the, I think it's crossfeed, when you get the sound from only that speaker, but the sound will reach this ear first and then it will reach the other ear, so you will have that sound in both ears. So it's a different experience with panning in headphones and with monitors. And you use panning in order to separate individual tracks in the mix. So for example, say you have a piano and you have a guitar and they're competing for the same frequency range. You can pan the guitar one way and the piano the other way, and both can live side by side. And then, as I mentioned before, you have plugins, and these are either stock plugins or third-party plugins, and you can load them up in your digital audio workstation. Given that you have a newer type of workstation, I know people that have older versions of Cubase, for example, and you don't have the ability to load up third-party plugins, but most newer DAWs has this opportunity. Third-party plugins. These can be EQs, compressors, saturators, limiters, clippers, special effects such as phasers, flangers, tremolos, tape stops, and also, of course, plugin synthesizers, plugin samplers, drum machines, and what have you. Then you have the EQ, and an EQ is simply a device that lets you tweak the gain, the volume, in different separate frequency ranges. So you have everything from the bass all the way up to the treble, from dark to bright, from whoop, like this. Here's a sine wave that goes from the deepest to the highest. Let's listen. Human hearing is around 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. and that's where the human hearing lives. And dogs, for example, can hear a much higher frequency. So you have infrasound, which is below 20 hertz, and then you have ultrasound, which is above 20,000 hertz. So say you want to lower a bit in the 40 hertz range, you can do that with an EQ. You can just turn it down. And the equalizer that is most popular these days are the parametric equalizer, which lets you grab a node on the EQ, and here's a specific frequency range, and then you can raise or lower the volume there, and you can select which curves you want to have. That's the Q, how sharp the cut should be or how wide it should be. And you can also use different shapes, such as the bell curve or the filter and the shelf. Those are the three most used curves in the equalizer. And in most modern equalizers, you can select if you want to tweak the stereo, or you can choose only sides or only the middle, the mono signal, or you can choose only the left or only the right. There are a lot of options these days. And then another key thing to use when mixing is compression. And a compressor is basically an automatic gain reduction machine that when a signal exceeds a certain threshold, the compressors make sure that it automatically turns down the volume. So that's a compressor. You just turn down the volume. Another type of compressor is in the real world is the compressor you use when you use nail guns. Poof. When you're an advanced diver, you might dive down with this compressed air bottle on your back, and the same principle is there, only that it's not automatic. Well, it gives you air automatically. So, and when you put in a nail to the wall, air is letting loose automatically. And the controls of a compressor, the standard controls, are the attack, which is how fast is the volume being clamped down on a certain sound, and then you have the release. That's how fast a sound is let go, volume is being turned up again. That's the release. And the ratio is by how much is the volume being clamped down. So for example, a ratio of 1 to 1, it's no reduction at all, whilst a ratio of 1 to 2 is that when something goes beyond the threshold that you can set by using the threshold button, it will clamp down by 2 units. So for example, you go 1 decibel over, it will clamp down 2 decibels down. And if you set the threshold really, really low, you will compress almost everything in a sound source. So you have to play with the threshold button. And then you have another setting on many compressors that's called the knee, and that's how hard the compressor is reacting, or how when it's first reacting, is it acting in a smooth slope, or is it acting abruptly and fast and sharp? In my own work, I don't pay much attention to the knee, but it really depends on the application. And finally, an important concept to understand when it comes to compressor is the concept of gain reduction. And gain reduction is basically by how many decibels does that sound get turned down. For example, when you see that the gain reduction meter, as you can see here, is down on -5, so it goes with 5 decibels of gain reduction. That's quite heavy compression, and you can go much further, and it really depends on the source and how much compression you want to apply. And as you can see in the later videos, I like to use several compressors in tandem to make a more clean and smooth compression experience, as you can say. And speaking of compressors, another group of plugins are the limiters. They are compressors, and they work really fast. So the main objective is to not let anything go past that limiter. There are settings that allow certain peaks to go beyond the threshold. Brick wall limiting is when nothing gets beyond a certain threshold. So everything remains at, for example, -1 in peak. And then you have saturation, and there are tons of different saturators. You just have to try out for yourself. Saturators are fun equipment to use because they can introduce distortion, warmth, polish. That's just a matter of experimentation and how far you want to push a certain saturator. So what they basically do is they introduce harmonic distortion. So and I'll show you an example here with a sine wave. without and with. You get more sound information out of that. In modern hip hop, you hear those 808s, they are often massively distorted, so that the bass reaches higher up in the frequency spectrum so that you can hear them with just the speakers on your phone, for example. And lousy audio equipment can also catch up with the bass. So the bass will invade the upper frequencies, so it's hearable. But saturation can be used for many things, and it's not rare that you use several stages of saturation in a mix. And this is really to color and shape the mix, and I love saturators. You have different types of saturators. You have emulations from different old school equipment, different types of consoles from back in the day, and tape machines and what have you. So it's a lot of fun. Then you have the mix knob, which is this, and this basically you can switch between wet and dry. 100% wet is that the signal is being 100% treated by the processor, whilst dry is 0% treatment of the processor, and you can switch in between and have some dry and some wet signal, and this gives you a lot of flexibility when treating a source. You can, for example, compress or distort a signal, and then you can back down and insert some more of the dry signal, and you can get a more balanced result. And then you have reverb, which is short for reverberation, and reverb is an emulation of a room or an environment that you don't have in the studio. It's used to increase depth in the mix and a sense of space. And the same goes for delay. It's like the echo, the sound that bounces between walls, for example, and you have different versions of that. And if you check out one of these two videos, you will see some examples. Okay, next up is the 2-track or stereo track. I talk about that a lot because sometimes you may buy a beat on BeatStars or Airbit or something, and then you will lay your vocals on top of that, and then you'll mix it afterwards. Then the beat, if that's only one file, a WAV file, this is a 2-track. There are 2 channels in every finished song, and that's the left and the right. So that's why it's called a 2-track or a stereo track. And if you like this video so far, hit the like button. And also consider subscribing if you want more videos like these. And the next thing I'm going to talk about is gain staging. Yes, you heard right. People talking about you have to gain stage. And it's really simple. Just make sure that each individual track in your mixing session doesn't exceed the peak level of 0. So make sure that it doesn't go into the red when you start your mixing session. And as I will show you, I am much more conservative than many others. I like to have it far down in the green. And gain staging becomes a principle when you apply processing. So if you put on an EQ, for example, and then you boost some here and then you boost some there, you will get an increase in gain, so the track will become louder. So for example, if you EQ a kick, boost some lows and you boost some highs, and you will eventually have increased that kick with maybe 2 decibels, who knows. Then you would have to turn that down by 2 dB. You will have to turn that EQ down by 2 dB, or insert a gain plugin next in the insert chain and lower that by 2 dB, so that you have the same level all along. And same goes for compression and saturation and every other insert plugin that you might want to insert on your channel. So that's gain staging, and that's really practical because when you gain stage, you can always A/B test to see what the plugin actually does without having to guess, because if it sounds louder, it sounds automatically better, so you get tricked by the loudness. So that's also a good thing about gain staging, but originally it was to prevent people from distorting their channels. So that's the background of it. And I mentioned processing, and that's everything that you do to manipulate a track using plugins, for example. And also you could say that automation, when you automate a track, make it go up and down in volume by itself, that might also be a form of processing. But everything that you do to manipulate your track, that's processing. Next up, it's a term called static mix, and it has actually two meanings. The way I use the term static mix is when I set up a mix. This is one of the stages in my mixing process. I will make the song sound as good as possible without using any type of processing, only using the channel faders and the paneration knobs, and really dial in the balance and making sure that everything sits tight in the mix without anything else. And that's the static mix, and that's the foundation of a good mix. I never put on any plugins on the mix before I really have dialed in the static mix. So that's the static mix. But another way you can use the term is to say that, oh, this mix sounds really static. It's a bit dull and flat and boring. And of course, if there's no movement in a mix, it sounds boring. So, but we will come back to that later. Next up, we have sends and returns, and that's basically you have a channel strip like this one, and then you send the audio signal from that channel strip over to an auxiliary channel like this one. And on this auxiliary channel, you can put on processing, for example, reverb, delay, or compression, EQ, whatever you want to experiment with. And then you can dial up and down in volume, how much volume you want to send into that other track, that aux track. So for example, when you are putting on reverb or delay, that's the typical use of an aux track with a send and return. And then the sound will return back into the mix bus. And this brings us over to the next term, which is groups and buses. And groups and buses are basically the same. It's just another word for it. So I have the mix bus. That's where everything goes in. All the tracks goes into the mix bus. But before they hit the mix bus, they hit other buses, which are sub buses or subgroups. So I like to, for example, have all my drum sounds go into one channel, which is called drum bus. And I have all my bass instruments go into a bass bus. And sometimes I would have only the kick for itself and the rest of the drums in another bus. And so this is grouping instruments together, like making stems, as I mentioned earlier. This is an ideal thing to do to not get overwhelmed in a mix. Say you have 60 tracks in a mix, and if you group those 60 tracks and break those down into 4 or 5, it's much easier to handle. You handle them group for group, and then you can adjust each group accordingly. Next term is aux, and that is when you send an audio signal from a channel strip over to another channel, and that's an auxiliary channel. And that's a bit different from a bus, because a bus is used to group several channel strips together or tracks together. But an aux is, for example, a channel that you use for reverb and delay and so on and so forth, as I explained earlier. Next up, tonal balance. And Isotope, for example, have the tonal balance control plugin, which I use all the time almost to check my mixes, and when mastering I like to use that to give me some hints and clues how my tonal balance is. But what is tonal balance? Well, that's the whole mix in relation to the frequency spectrum. So you have everything from what is, as I said before, the human hearing goes from 20 Hertz to 20,000 Hertz, and it's the balance between the highs, the lows, and the mid-range. So as you can see demonstrated here, you see that the bass is always a bit louder and the high end is always a bit lower in volume. And this is because the human hearing has different sensitivity for different frequency ranges, so we have to turn up the bass. The bass has to be louder, always, almost always. As you can see here in this plugin, it has analyzed thousands of songs and come down to bass heavy music, for example. It has this type of typical tonal balance. If something is a bit off, it will give you some clues to that, and you can act accordingly. Sometimes things need to be a bit off. If it sounds good, it sounds good, but the tonal balance is that it's enough bass, enough high frequencies, and enough mid-range. That's the whole idea of the tonal balance, that there needs to be enough volume in all the frequency ranges. So that's the tonal balance. And then comes the stereo image, and that's all the things that happens from right to left. And of course, dead center in the middle. So you have this whole range here, what you hear on the left ear, what you hear on the right ear, and everything that's in between. That's the stereo image of a song. We have endless possibilities of playing with the stereo field, and it's really exciting, trying to make our mixes wider and to create a more immersive sound experience. When something is stereo per se is when it has a lot of difference between the left and the right channel. We notice that there are different things going on both sides. If both sides are identical, we will have a mono signal. So for example, sub bass and kick are usually in the dead center in mono, but for example, guitars and pianos and hi-hats and will be different on the left and the right channels. Now I'm going to talk about loudness, and I have 4 terms that I need you to know, and some of them are more important than others. I'll take the most important term first, and that's LUFS. LUFS stands for loudness units full scale, and that's the modern way of measuring how loud a song is, and it's time-based so that it takes the average volume of a song and gives you a reading. So for example, if you have a song with a lot of quiet parts and some really loud parts, you would get maybe a lower LUFS than you would, for example, measuring only the loud parts, if that makes sense. So when you are uploading a song to Spotify, for example, Spotify wants, I think it's -14 LUFS. Of course, most people upload at -10, 8, or even -6 LUFS, and it's really what sounds good that is the most important thing, and making sure that your song doesn't sound quieter than the next song on the playlist. LUFS is the preferred way of measuring the loudness because it takes in consideration the human hearing. We are sensitive to different frequency ranges, and the LUFS takes consideration to that. And then we have RMS, which stands for root mean square. It's basically more or less the same as LUFS. It takes more into consideration the numbers. It's not that tailored towards the human hearing as LUFS is. But RMS and LUFS tend to be quite the same. And then you have another term, and that's peak. And peak means that the loudest part of the song, and it's like the loudest spike of volume, gets measured all the time. So it's constantly bouncing up and down. And as you see here, this is a peak meter, and you see it goes up and down, up and down. The loudest peak is always displayed with a number like this. And then you have true peak, which is basically the same. It's another term, but it's still almost the same, and it's a bit more accurate. Next term is reference tracks. And reference tracks is basically some songs that you can find on Spotify or wherever you listen to music that are professionally mixed and mastered, that you like the sound of and is somewhat similar to the song you are mixing or making, so that you can hear, okay, where in this song is the kick, how loud is the kick in relation to the snare, for example, how loud is the vocals in relation to the bass. You can go on a quest in the song to find out, okay, where is what. And this is just a matter of practice, and the more you practice, the more you will hear what goes on in a certain song. It's like listening critically, analytically, to find out where are the elements in the mix, what is on the right, what's panned left in the song, how much reverb is being used, what is being used reverb on, and so on and so forth. And then you can apply that wisdom or knowledge in your own mixing, and it will enhance your results by a lot. There's a video about referencing and listening. You can go check it out there. Next up is A/B testing, and this is, for example, if you have a reference track, you can A/B your reference track with your own song, or you can A/B test certain plugin chains, for example, to see what you're doing is making any sense, and most importantly, making any progress in your sound and music. Next up, the mono button, and that's something that you can just insert as the last plugin in your mixing session. For example, a gain plugin like this. You hit mono on the plugin and then you bypass it, and whenever you engage it, your whole mix will be rendered down to mono. This is practical when mixing a large project where there are a lot of stuff going on, a lot of stereo information. If you just render it down to mono, it's easier to hear the balance, and it's easier to hear if there's phase issues, if something sounds weaker or thinner whenever you switch on the mono button, you could go back into the mix and check, has something strange happened here? Try to bypass some plugins and see what's going on. Next term, monitors and headphones. I'll just throw headphones in there as well. So monitors is not this in the mixing situation, but this. Another word for monitors would be loudspeakers, and they're usually active, but for example, the ones I have, the NS10s, they are passive. They need an external amplifier, but the others, the vocals, they are active. And I have a couple of pairs of cans as well, headphones. I like to say cans because that's what the youth says. I like to use both headphones and loudspeakers when I mix, especially when panning and using reverb and delay and such. It's really valuable to check in both headphones and the monitor speakers because there is a lot of difference. Also, when it comes to bass, headphones go a lot deeper down in the spectrum than normal loudspeakers would. So you would really have to invest in room treatments and expensive subwoofers in order to get the same result as you would get from a decent pair of headphones. So checking bass in headphones is golden, but there are also other ways of checking bass with monitors that I can show you in, for example, this video. Next up, acoustic treatment. And I want to throw in another term, soundproofing. Those two terms are being mixed up a lot. And soundproofing is when you treat the walls in your room or the ceiling with material that will prevent sound from coming out and leak out into other rooms. And that's especially important if you live in an apartment and you want to record music. There are a lot of techniques in how to soundproof, leaving air gaps. Then comes acoustic treatment, and that has nothing to do with soundproofing. Acoustic treatment is basically to make sure that all the resonances and the echoes or reverb, room reverb is being not necessarily eliminated, but clamped down on. So for example, you would put on some panels, and you can see here, right behind me here, I have some acoustic panels, and those are to eliminate room reverberance. So whenever I make a sound in this room, it will go straight to the wall in front of me, bounce right back, and it will hit these nice acoustic panels. Last term I'm going to bring up is dithering, and that's something that you really just need to keep off. You don't need to engage dithering in your mix, especially not as a beginner. But what it basically does is it manipulates your audio and makes it a bit smoother when you're exporting it to a lower bit rate. But you really don't have to think a lot about that. But what you need to think about is how to set up your mix. And in this video, I will show you how to set your mix up for success. I will show you 3 important things to consider when you're setting up a mix, and if you don't do these 3 things, your mix is destined to be a mess. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope I see you in the next video. Peace!